Now we will learn how to join our squares using the continuous join as you go method. We have our squares out in fours, and we are going to start in the bottom right corner of our first square. So take your main color yarn, or whatever color you want, and we're going to join our yarn in the bottom right corner in this chain 2 corner. Then chain 3 and finish a granny cluster, so place 2 double crochet. All right, great. Now we're going to work like this. We're going to go down this side, across, and back down. And then when we get here, we are going to just place 1 granny cluster. So let's go ahead and do that together. So basically in each space, we're going to be placing granny clusters, and then in the corner spaces, we're going to place the granny cluster corner. And if you don't know what that means, you can check the description below. So I'll just do this with you for now. Actually, go ahead and in each granny cluster space, place your granny clusters. In these 2 corners, place full corners. So granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster. And then when you get to the bottom left corner, place 1 granny cluster and then stop, and we'll meet. This is what it should look like. You have your 2 granny cluster corners, and then we went down to the bottom left-hand granny cluster corner and just placed 1 granny cluster. And that's because we are now going to join our second square. So this can be a little tricky. So in order to do that, let's chain 1. And we're going to be joining into the bottom right square of our second square. So let's chain 1 and yarn over, and then insert your hook into the chain 2 space, and flip your granny square over because we're going to place a double crochet. And then place 2 more to complete the granny cluster. Now to join the 2, let's move those away. To join the 2 together, we're going to be doing slip stitches into the first granny square, into the granny cluster spaces, and then we will place granny clusters on this side. So I'll show you. Let's slip stitch, place a granny cluster, okay. Find the next available space, which would be this one. Slip stitch, granny cluster, okay, then slip stitch into the next available space, just like that. And you're going to continue down. We'll do this together. Continue all the way down. If I'm going too fast, you can pause the video, but I'm not that fast, so don't mind my cat in the background or the sound of my cat's water fountain, please. He just woke up, so he might be a little noisy. Let's get some more yarn. Okay, and then we are now on our last granny cluster. So let's go ahead and slip stitch into the last available space. And now we are going to place a granny cluster corner here. Don't worry about these 2 corners not being joined because we're actually going to join them in a moment. Okay. So now we are going to continue placing granny clusters in each space, and in the top left corner of your second square, just place 1 granny cluster because we are going to bring in our third square and join it. So go ahead and do that until you reach this corner. Place your granny cluster and let's meet. Okay, I've placed my granny cluster in that corner, and now again, just like down here, we're going to join these 2 squares together. Okay, so we now need to do what we did last time. So chain 1, and we're going to be working into the bottom left corner, just placing 1 granny cluster. So yarn over, insert your hook into that corner, and you can flip it around to make it easier, and place your granny cluster. And just like before, we are now going to join these two sides together. Oh, my poor little cat is jealous. So let's find the next available spot, slip stitch in, and place a granny cluster. Don't worry, he's fine. He's just jealous that I'm not paying attention to him right now. Okay, place your granny cluster, slip stitch in, place a granny cluster. Okay, so now continue to place slip stitches into the second square and a granny cluster in the third square. And continue to do that all the way until this space here, and then we're going to talk about how to join these two corners. Okay, so now you should have had your granny cluster and your last slip stitch. So now place one granny cluster into this corner, and we are going to join the opposite corner in that first square together. So we're going to chain one, insert your hook under the chain two here, slip stitch, chain one again, and you can kind of pull that tight, and then place a granny cluster back into this space. And we just joined those two corners together. And now go ahead and place a granny cluster in each one of these spaces, and then stop when you get to the corner space here. Okay, now we're going to place a granny cluster into this space because we need to join our fourth and last square. So let's take a look like this. We joined our first square, second square, third square. Now bring in your fourth square, and we are going to be joining into the top left corner. So take your squares, move them aside so it's easier. Okay, now chain one, yarn over, and again insert your hook into that chain two space. And because it's easier, we're going to start flipping it around, and then place a double crochet, and then two more. Now let's turn it over. So now we're going to be slip stitching into this space on our third square. So go ahead and slip stitch in. Ooh, that was a bit of a hard one. And now place a granny cluster into the next granny cluster space on our fourth square. Now go ahead and slip stitch down into the next space. And the granny cluster into the fourth square. Okay, so continue to place the slip stitches into the third square, granny clusters into the fourth square until you get to this space, and we're going to join these two corners. Okay, and now after we place that granny cluster, chain two. My cat's enjoying a snack. And you're going to insert your hook underneath this connector, and insert your hook underneath the chain two and slip stitch it through. Okay, good. And then you will chain one more time and then place a granny cluster back into that corner space to complete your corner. Okay, good. We just joined the corners here. And now we are going to place we have to join this fourth square to our first square. So place a slip stitch directly into this space, and then place a granny cluster into the fourth square. Okay, continue placing slip stitches and then granny clusters all the way down until we get to here. Okay, place your last granny cluster before the chain two space. Place your last slip stitch into this space before the chain 2 space, or the granny cluster chain 2, I guess. And now we're going to connect these 2 corners. So place a granny cluster into the corner space, chain 1, slip stitch into the opposite corner space, chain 1 again, and then place a granny cluster directly back in to complete the corner. So we just connected the 2 corner spaces, and now go ahead and place a granny cluster in each space, granny cluster corner, and a granny cluster all the way down until you reach your next unfinished corner over here. Okay, this is what it should look like so far, and now let's join this corner. So we already have 1 granny cluster. Let's finish the corner. Place a granny cluster here. Then, just like before, we are going to chain 1, slip stitch into here, chain 1, and then place a granny cluster. Now again, go ahead and place your granny clusters all the way around your granny cluster corner, and let's stop right here so we can finish this corner. Okay, I finished my last granny cluster, and now again, let's do our corner. So finish off this corner by placing a granny cluster, chain 1, slip stitch into this space here, chain 1 again, and then place a granny cluster into the next corner. Okay, good, so we have to do that again. So what we did over here and what we did over here, we have to go all the way around and do it in this corner again. So go ahead, finish your corner, and then let's meet to finish off our square. Okay, I just went all the way around my second square, went over here, joined my 2 row end corners together by placing the granny cluster, chain 1, slip stitch, chain 1, granny cluster, and now we're almost finished. So all we have to do is place granny clusters all the way down, and we have to finish this, this corner. So let's place our granny clusters. All the way down. Hopefully that fountain is relaxing for you, maybe, I hope. Whoa. Okay, we've reached our corner, so all we have to do is place our last granny cluster, and to complete the corner, we have to chain 2, and then slip stitch into the top of the chain 3, just like that. Fasten off, cut your yarn, and I have my scissors right now, and then you have completed joining your 4 squares. Thanks.